Chapter 2 of Tractate Eruvin deals with the issue of wells on Shabbos, among some other topics. The interior of a well is usually deep and wide enough that it's considered as a private property, and drawing water to the surface is then taking it to a public property, so that's not allowed. This was very problematic for all the people traveling to Jerusalem by the holiday pilgrimages, so there were leniencies allowed to erect a partition around the well, allowing you to draw water from it. The Mishnah says, to be able to draw water from a well on Shabbos, you need to construct 4 double posts bent at right angles around the corners. Others say you need an additional 4 single posts in between. Their height must be 10 handbreadths, their width must be 6 handbreadths, and they can be any thickness. The gaps between posts may be as wide as 2 teams of 3 oxen, which will be explained to be about 10 cubits. Others say 2 teams of 4 oxen, 3.5 cubits, and it's where the oxen are tied together. And one team is entering and the other is exiting, to be precise in the amounts. You can bring the posts closer together as long as there's space between for a cow's head and most of its body to be in the enclosure and drink. You can expand the boards as much as you want as long as you add boards so the gaps are never too wide. Some limit this size to 2 base se'ah, which is 50 by 50 cubits, so double that, which is 100 by 50. Others say that limitation only applies to a garden or similar, and other enclosures can be much bigger. The Gemara says an opinion that doesn't allow this by a water hole, but permits it by a well. We try to bring some other opinions that seemingly disagree, but they are proven to be discussing different situations. It gets into some translation with the Mishnah, and it branches off into a side topic. An opinion states that Adam had a second body attached to his back, Eve, which was later detached. Some say it was actually a tail. Based on these arguments, there are a number of verses argued over. It's largely a repeat of a conversation that was at the end of Tractate Brachos on page 61a. This is discussed further. Repeating some points, it says that the male was in front, as it's very immodest for a man to walk behind a woman, and similar, as it says, Manoah arose and followed his wife, which implies that he was an ignorant man, as he was following his wife being behind her, which is, we said, inappropriate. But others disagree, saying that it says the same thing about Elkanah and Elisha, so it means that they followed her advice, not literally walking behind her. There are other points about not going behind a woman, better to go behind a lion, but it's better to go behind a woman than to go behind an idol, and it's better to go behind an idol than to go behind a synagogue when they're praying and not enter. There are further teachings that Adam fathered spirits, demons, and Liliths after his banishment from the Garden of Eden from involuntary emissions, not from relations, as it says that he fasted and refrained from intimacy and wore fig branches for 130 years after. Another teaching, you can give part of a person's praise in their presence, but all of their praise only when they're not there, so that way you don't look like you're flattering them. It also says that the dove returned to Noah with an olive leaf to demonstrate that it would rather bitter food from God than sweet food from humans. Another teaching, any house that hears words of Torah at night will never be destroyed. It also says that since the destruction of the temple, it's enough for the world to use the 2-letter name of God. It also says that when Babylon was cursed, its neighbors were also cursed, and when Samaria was cursed, its neighbors were blessed. Another teaching, God is different than mortals, that when a king punishes somebody, they block his mouth with a piece of wood so that way he doesn't curse the king. But when God punishes somebody, that person is silent. Then it goes into a point on Gehenna. It says that Jewish sinners repent, but idol worshippers that sin don't repent even at the gates of Gehenna. It also says that the fires of Gehenna don't have complete hold over the Jewish people within, all based on verses. It also says an opinion that Abraham reaches into Gehenna and removes the Jewish people that didn't marry idol worshippers and shamefully cover their circumcision. It also taught that there are 3 entrances to Gehenna, in the desert, in the sea, and in Jerusalem, based on verses. Some say there's another entrance in the valley of Ben Hinnom, where there are 2 palm trees with smoke rising between them, but some say that's just the Jerusalem one that we referenced. It also lists the 7 names of Gehenna: Sheol, Abaddon, Annihilation; Be'er Shachas, Well of Destruction; Bar Sha'on, Pit of Turbulent Waters; Tit Hayavin, the Mire; Tzalmaves, Shadow of Death; and Eretz Hatachtis, the Underworld. It brings all of the sources. Although it's just called Gehenna, which means the Valley of Immorality. It mentions some other potential names, and then says that the entrance to the Garden of Eden is either in Israel, so it's by Beis Sha'an, or it's in Arabia, so it's by Beis Goyrim, and if it's between the rivers, the entrance is at Dumaskanin. It also talks about the fruits of these regions. Back to the original topic, it says the oxen, as measurements, are actually tied together, not just next to each other. It also gives the measurements of the average cow. It then gives the measurements of the amounts we said, which was either 10 or 13.5 cubits. By a well 8 cubits wide, both opinions agree that you need the corner posts, and if it's 12 or more cubits wide, they both agree that you need the middle posts also. The argument is where it's between those amounts. There are a few miscellaneous points on this and some questions and answers on particularly unique cases. One of the questions, for instance, is what if a courtyard extends right up against this well region? Can you cross between your private domain to somebody else's? So we say yes, as that well isn't considered to have residence. If two adjacent courtyards open right into the well area, you can't carry within, as then people will think that the board situation is viable to connect two courtyards, which it's not. You need a proper connection. Others allow it if there's a proper Eruv on the courtyard. Another question, if the well dries up, can you still use this enclosure? We say no, but allow it if the well refills itself. Others disagree. We also bring a discussion that says that the partitions still function even if traffic passes through them. This gets into another point about drinking over a domain line. We bring a case. What if you have your well and an animal's trough extends into the well domain? So we say that you can pour buckets from the well into the part of the trough that's in the domain and let it flow out to the animal, but you may not carry the bucket over the trough and pour it straight by the animal out of a concern that you might notice an issue with the trough and mistakenly put the bucket down in the public domain and then put it in the trough, which is transferring an item from a public to a private domain, which is not allowed. We give a slightly modified version of this discussion. We also mentioned that camels are unique, that they need to be mostly inside the enclosure, as they have a long neck, and it could reach further into a public domain. This is discussed further. Some say that the well partition can only be used by the pilgrims, some allow its use for other animals too. Some specify that it needs to be good quality water for a person for him to be able to use this. This is discussed further. Some say that this well board leniency only applies in Israel and Babylonia, nowhere else, as those have big schools that students would frequently travel between, among other differences. Others exclude Babylonia from this as it has plenty of water. This is discussed further along with the interpretation of several verses. Some other verses are expounded on. It also talks about the importance of following the teachings of the sages, such as that Rabbi Akiva was incarcerated by the Romans prior to his execution, and a sage brought him water, which he would drink and use to wash his hands, a rabbinic ordinance. A guard came over to him and he said that he had way too much water. Perhaps he was trying to dig his way out, so he only gave him half the water, so Rabbi Akiva only used that for washing his hands. The sages said about this that he must have been comparatively so much greater in his youth, and when he was out of prison. There are more verses expounded on about the teachings and institutions of King Solomon. There are further verses which are defined. We go back to the well and further define the dimensions of the base area. New Mishnah. If the path of the public property cut through the posts, you have to divert the thoroughfare to the side. Others say you don't have to. Some say that the city of Jerusalem requires its doors on either end to be closed, so it's not a public domain. Others disagree. There are other opinions on this broad. Some say that the entirety of Israel is not a public domain, but this is in reference to the steep slopes of Jerusalem, which are difficult to traverse, so are not considered a public domain. We bring sources. We further discuss what the differences are if the thoroughfare passes over a mound 10 handbreadths tall by 4 cubits. There are some more miscellaneous cases discussed. New Mishnah. You can make this well partition for a public water hole, or a well, or a private well. For a private water hole, it requires 10 handbreadth high boards all around. Others say you can only make the board partition by a public well. Everything else would require an enclosure made of ropes that's 10 handbreadths high. The Gemara says that we follow the opinion that well boards are only allowed by a public well and only for spring water, and we need both of these rules. New Mishnah, an additional statement. Some say that a garden or similar, which is a bit over 70 by 70 cubits, which has a 10 handbreadth fence around it, you can carry inside it, as long as it has a watchman's booth or a dwelling within or it's near a city. Others say it's fine if it only contains a water hole, ditch, or cave. Some say that as long as it abides by those measurements, it's fine to carry within without any structure of a sort inside. Some say that if it's longer than it is wide by even a cubit, you can't carry inside. Others say it's fine even if it's twice as long as it is wide. Some say that it can be even as large as a base car, which is about 75,000 square cubits. Some other opinions, if many people join their houses in a shared courtyard with an Eruv and one forgot to, he cannot use the courtyard, but his neighbors that did make the Eruv can go in and out of his house. Another miscellaneous teaching from the sage, you can eat maror on Pesach by eating arkablin, which is a vine that grows around palm trees, but there was nobody to corroborate this opinion. The Gemara asks, why did this Mishnah start by saying additionally? In addition to what? So the sage being quoted in the last Mishnah is being re-quoted here, but we interrupted his last point with a different subject, so we used the word additionally. The difference between two of the opinions that are essentially seemingly the same that we listed is that they disagree over the small amount between a full base sa'ah, which is 5,000 square cubits, and the 70 and a fraction, which is slightly less than 5,000. We learn about the dimensions from some calculations by the construction of the tabernacle. This is discussed along with some opinions on who we hold like. Some other rules: this enclosed area we're speaking of, if it was enclosed for residential use, you can carry in it even if it's larger than 5,000 square cubits. But if majority of it has vegetables planted in it, it's considered to be a garden and then you can't carry inside. But if you planted trees, it's considered like a courtyard and you can carry. Some qualifications: some say that if it's exactly 5,000 square cubits or less, it's fine even with the vegetables. This is argued on for a bit. The point on most being trees being allowed to carry within. Some say that's only if the trees are planted in rows, others disagree. Another point: if the enclosure is larger than the 5,000 cubits and it's not for a residential purpose, but you build a house next to it, how do you designate it as a residential courtyard? So it's suggested to make a breach over 10 cubits wide and then repair part of it so it's now less than 10 cubits, so it's been re-enclosed for residential use, and that makes it permissible. Okay, but what if you break and repair the wall 1 cubit at a time? Is that allowed, or does it have to be all at once? So we bring a proof from a case of a sandal and laws of impurity where it's breaking apart in sections, and we say that it is permissible. Another opinion: if you have a back lot behind your house that's over 5,000 square cubits, a back lot isn't really for residential use, you can't carry all around in it. However, if you made an entrance to it from your house, it's allowed, as long as that was done before the enclosing of the lot. This applies even when there's a granary in the backyard, so the entrance isn't just opened in the first place for the intent of the granary, it was also made for the back lot. Another point: if this enclosure of over 5,000 square cubits for residential use became filled with water, some say that this is like when it's filled with vegetables, which makes it impermissible. Some others say it's when it's like it's filled with trees, which makes it permissible. Some say it varies if the water is fit for use, others say it varies if the water is deep. Others disagree on the deep point, saying it's comparable to a mound of produce, which doesn't create variation due to its height. Another case: a back lot over 5,000 cubits, which one side opened into a mavoi, and the other side opened into a path through some vineyards which led to a river. None of these areas are permissible because they connect to the forbidden lot, as it's too big. So it was suggested that they should put a post by the end of the vineyard path, thus fixing that one, and that by extension should also fix the back lot. Some don't allow this, as the only reason that post works is because the riverbank is acting as a partition, so if you allow this, then people would think that it's always allowed even without the river. A different solution is to put a post by the back lot of the first mavoi, and it'll close the mavoi and the back lot. So you can now carry in the mavoi and in the back lot, but it's an argument if you can carry between the two. The difference is whether you hold people might live in the back lot, which makes it a separate residence than the mavoi, and there's issue with carrying between two adjacent domains if they're owned by different residents. Another situation: if you have a too large back lot, you can't reduce its size by planting trees inside, but you may build a 10x4 handbreadth pillar within to make it small enough that it's allowed. If the width of the pillar is less than 3 handbreadths, it's not valid, as it's deemed insignificant. If it's between 3 and 4 handbreadths wide, it's an argument. Back to a prior case where the lot is next to a house and you want to make an entrance to allow it for residential use. Another option is to create a new wall at the back end of the lot, at least 4 handbreadths away, to re-enclose it and allow carrying. 3 handbreadths is too small, and again there's an argument by between 3 and 4 handbreadths. Another option: you can put mud on the inside of the walls until it's smaller than 5,000 square cubits. If the mud can stand on its own, this works. If it can't stand on its own, it's an argument. If at the back end of the lot there's a mound, you can build a partition 4 handbreadths away to make it permissible to carry within. There's an argument if it's less than 3 handbreadths away, or it's on the upper edge of the mound, based on whether you're allowed to build a partition on top of a partition. We cite many cases to figure out who's right, but the result seems to be that it's not allowed to do that. Another case: if you have a lot far over the size of 5,000 cubits, which is 2 base sa'ah, here the lot is the size of 3 base sa'ah, and you cover a third of it. Some say that it doesn't create a separation, so you can't carry anywhere within. Others say that it divides the lot into two sections where neither of them exceed 5,000 square cubits, so you can now carry anywhere within. The logics are explained. Some say the variation is where we're dealing with a slanted roof. Some rule that if a 5,000 square cubit lot is breached entirely into a courtyard, you can't carry within, as the space is combined to be over the limit and the walls aren't acting as a partition. Another case: an orchard in somebody's backyard. The wall of the house acts as one of the walls. But if the wall collapses, now the inside wall of the house can act as the wall, so you can still carry within. However, others disagree, as the inner wall was made for the inside of the house, not for the outside. Another case, there was an arbor, enclosed little orchard in the backyard of a sage. So, in order to be able to carry there, they erected a fence of sticks on either side of the path, each less than 3 handbreadths apart. Others disagreed and said it was fine without the sticks, but others said that building an orchard or even a house in a lot afterwards doesn't reclassify it as permissible, so actually you should have had the sticks there. We bring sources and proofs. We said in the Mishnah that some hold it's permitted if the lot is as large as a base car. We bring a source for the argument, and it also expounds on a verse that when Chizkiah became ill, Yeshayahu established a yeshiva for students to learn Torah next door in their merit to protect him. Some say we should always do this for a sick person, and others say no, as it could incite Satan, the angel of death, against you. The remaining cases are discussed and argued over, along with a definition as to what the vines we mentioned were. And that's the end of chapter 2.